Hi guys, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is lecture 5 of grade 2, and today we're going to be discussing the out of position game. I decided that this should have the title it does because playing out of position is a completely different beast to playing in position. It may as well be a different game entirely with a different set of rules. Today we're going to learn a bit about how to slow play out of position, the lenience for actually playing your hand more slowly in GTO out of position. Game theory really doesn't demand that we play a fully aggressive strategy. You're going to see a lot of tricky, trappy play, and you're going to see a lot of maybe what may seem weird in terms of bet sizes to begin with, but will make a lot of sense as we progress through this lecture. Without any further ado, let's get into it. We're going to start with a delayed c-bet opportunity spot here as a warm-up. This spot will serve as a template for the beginning of this class, and we have ace-9 for blind versus blind, and flop goes check-check, single raise pot. On the 8 of spades 3 flush turn, small blind has the choice between checking and betting 1/3 of the pot. We already know that on flush turns, a toolkit of b33 and check is going to work perfectly well. The reason for this is that the big blind player's range is much more polarized compared to the small blind player's range on this turn card than it would be on some brick. On a brick turn like the deuce of hearts, for instance, the small blind would still have a large nut advantage, having slow played a lot of their stronger hands on the flop, not having much urgency there, and thus would carry that nut advantage into the turn and would want to capitalize on that by including a big bet in their game plan. On the 8 of spades, however, there's no need for such a big bet because big blind's range is going to be split pretty starkly between hands that have a spade and high EV, or even better, have 2 spades, and hands that don't and have low EV. It won't be hands like 2 pair in big blind's range here because the in position player has to fast play the flop with those hands. But which of the following hands do you think it would be a mistake to check here in small blind shoes? Remember, your only options are check and bet, 33% pot. Which hands do you have to bet? Which hands are you not allowed to check? First option, jack-9 of spades. Is it a mistake to check this hand? Have a think about it. Eights. What about this one? King-queen with the queen of spades. Can you check this one? And finally, the queen-10 offsuit. Is it okay to check this? Pause the video now. I'd like you to write yes if you think it's a mistake to check next to these hands, and no if you think it's not a mistake to check. But let's see how you did. How many yeses did you have? You should have only had one. There's only one hand here that it's a mistake to check. Jack-9 of spades is not at all a mistake to check. In fact, the solver gravitates towards checking this hand. Not to say it's bad to bet, clearly it can value bet. You'll note that having the 9 is a sort of blocker that we'll get onto later in this class, but it's going to make it harder to get called by villains' flop check behind range because a big component part of that is 9x, and we block that. Flushes are always going to do, moreover, a bad job of unblocking the calling range, and a good job, sadly, of blocking that calling range. Therefore, when you have a hand like Jack-9 of spades, there's a trade-off going on, and it's also okay to play this hand in a manner in which you seek to maximize EV against the bottom of villain's range, understanding that you block the higher up parts. How often do you consider that your opponent is holding a hand here like the Queen-6 of clubs? You completely unblock that hand, and if you saw that villain had the Queen-6 of clubs when you have a flush, and was therefore drawing dead, and was never going to be able to continue against any bet size, how would you play? Would you bet and just end the hand 100% of the time, or would you check? That's right, you would certainly check, and you would hope that villain either hit a pair on the river with which they could bluff catch, or more likely, bluff now or on the end. Remember, it's not all about targeting. We hate the word targeting here at the Carrot Poker School because it's a blinkered, tunnel vision kind of trap. We care more about looking at the holistic picture. We don't want to target a worse value hand. When villain has a worse flush, when villain has 2 pair or an ace, they're going to bet a lot anyway. We don't have to target such a hand. What we do want to be aware of is that this hand, while it's okay to value bet, it's not urgent enough here that we have to bet, and there are other parts of villain's range which we unblock that we can get EV from by checking. Eights is similar. Again, you're blocking the middle of your opponent's range. We're going to call this a polarizing blocker. And I'm going to introduce this now, although there's a slide on this later. It's a bit of a tricky concept, and so I want to make sure that we start getting it down pat immediately in this lecture. That when you block the middle of your opponent's range, you polarize their range, right? By removing the middle part, they become more pushed towards the extremities. And as the hands on the extremities are more likely to bet, we know that people bet with polar ranges, we're bet more inclined to slow play with these kinds of blockers. These are polarizing blockers. King-Queen is actually a pure check. Why would you bet this hand? You're not bluffing, because villain isn't folding a pair to your sizing here. And no, betting bigger is not the remedy to that. You don't have to bluff just because you have a spade. That's not the point. You have showdown value. You have a medium equity hand. you have a second nut flush draw, not even a nut flush draw. What's the purpose of betting? It's too thin for value, it's far too good to bluff. There's not really a clear incentive for making a bet with this hand. Therefore, by process of elimination, but also through logic, we arrive at the conclusion that the Queen 10 offsuit is the only hand here that is actually a mistake to check. This is due to a concept called frailty. We're going to talk today about how frailness works and explain that frail hands, meaning ones that cannot really continue by facing bets so effectively, may have to bet if they have too much going on to want to check fold. Queen 10 offsuit is the kind of hand that would be a bit of a shame to check fold here. If we did face a bet, we would be folding a little bit more equity than we were comfortable with. In other words, villain's denial would be a little bit too high through that bet, and therefore we want to go ahead and bet ourselves because we don't have another route to continuing with this hand after checking. Check raising is not completely out of the question, but on a 3 flush turn, we usually want to be a bit more selective than a hand like this, which is going to block some of villain's folds and not really have enough redraw, especially nutted redraw to check raise in what will become an unfavourable spot after we check and face a bet. In other words, intuition will lead most people astray in this spot when they're trying to build a theoretically sound strategy. The hands that least look like bets are actually bets, and the hands that might be very tempting to bet for one reason or another are very slow playable. The theme for today, for the out of position game, is that we can do much more slow playing than you would think. Let's talk about urgency. We can say that a value candidate hand has urgency when it would experience a theoretical EV loss, that means in the solver, maybe not in reality, from checking instead of betting, or from betting smaller instead of larger. Just as checking instead of betting some sizing is a slow play, betting 1/3 pot with the nuts on the river is also a slow play because it's very far from the max investment that hand could make. In other words, you'd be relying on villain raising rather than calling if you were to pick such a sizing in order for them to have the same EV. Urgency is determined by SPR, basically the bigger the pot is in relation to its final pot size, that investment ceiling, the less urgent it is to grow the pot immediately because you're already closer to being able to put in all of the money. But in a single raise pot, you have to bet a set in position on the flop because it's too urgent to grow that pot, and if you don't bet, you know you're going to go to the turn in a stagnated and medium-sized pot instead of a big one. When you're in position, urgency is going to be a bit different to out of position depending on the action sequence that you're facing. But generally speaking, when you're out of position, there are more nodes remaining in the game tree if you check. So this means that the time for pot building is greater, and it gives you the option of check raising as a form of building the pot. There's a really important rule in the carrot poker school that will stand you in good stead to remember throughout, and that rule is that if check raise is viable, you probably don't have to value bet. Same goes with a bluff. If you have a hand that could check raise bluff, you probably don't have to bet that hand. The problem with the Queen 10 offsuit on that 3 flush turn blind versus blind was that it wasn't really of a high enough caliber of hand to check raise bluff, and it had to invest therefore. We have this diagram which is very simple. All this is really doing is illustrating that when you're on the flop, there are more streets remaining than when you're on the river. It sounds incredibly obvious, but it's something that's well worth understanding explicitly. We need to also comprehend that there can be half streets in a game. So if you think of a street as 2 nodes, my chance to bet and then your chance to bet, if we're out of position and in position respectively, so there can easily be 1.5 streets or 2.5 streets remaining in a hand. Or in other words, there could be 3 nodes or 5 nodes or something like that. New nodes develop when a player has a chance to raise, but just now we're thinking mainly about betting opportunities. The reason that you'll see game theory do a lot of slow playing out of position on the flop and not have to bet its value hands yet is that there's just a lot of time left for pot building and check raise is a viable option. I'm always saying to my private students that the out of position game is tricky trappy. Whenever they're out of position, I'm trying to drill it into their head that they are the snake in the grass. They are the player that's allowed to be a little bit less transparent when it comes to how they're playing the value hands. You only want to play a strategy like betting all of your value hands if the urgency for growing the pot forces you to. If on the other hand, you're in a situation where it's not so urgent that you build that pot immediately, you want to be able to disguise your strategy and have some of these hands in your slow play ranges as well, your checking ranges or your smaller bets. The out of position game involves a lot more check in B33 with powerful hands than would happen in position, because there's more time left and check raising an option. What we have to understand is that we don't want to get stuck in the mindset of only prioritizing getting value from worse hands. If we do this, we're going to ignore most of the game tree. It's very tempting when you make a really good hand to expect that your main source of EV comes from coolering your opponent or running into their second best hand, because that's the most dramatic thing that happens. And of course, going bet, bet, bet is one way to get maximum value when that happens. However, there's two things here. You can also check raise when that situation occurs where villain has a second best made hand, because they'll bet a lot anyway if it's such a good holding, and also that's not the full story. You have the rest of your opponent's range to think about and to try to get value from. And sometimes when villain has nothing, you get more value by slow playing than you do by fast playing. For example, let's say that we start off on the flop here. We're going to go through all three streets of this hand, but we begin on the flop with pocket sixes. If you give this hand to a fairly untrained poker player, their initial reaction is going to want to be to bet the flop, because they're drawn like a moth to the flame towards the idea of getting value from worse hands, and maybe they're obsessing about villain having a draw and wanting to get money into the pot against that, or maybe they're even delusional and think they can make their opponent fold a draw. That's not happening. No draw here of any worth is going to be folding to a small bet, and no, that's not a reason to bet bigger either. The fact is that with sixes, because check raising is also totally okay, you can slow play this hand. And because this board is pretty bad for your range overall as a small blind opener, you can do a lot of checking here in general. And because you'll have so many combos that are actually mandatory checks here, like ace jack of clubs, for example, you'll have many combinations of that ilk. You'll want to check your good hands too. Your opponent understands that 7-6-3, at least in game theory, is a good board for them, and so they're supposed to have a decent, healthy bet frequency on such a texture. That means that when you check, you can expect a lot of betting from your opponent, and when you bet small, you can expect a fair degree of raising as well. No surprise that when we consider all of that, pocket sixes is able to slow play on this flop. No problem. The flop strategy we're deploying here is what we're going to refer to as a mixed polarized strategy. What that means is that while we're actually going to be betting for value sometimes with these good hands, we're also mixing them between betting and checking. In the mixed polarized strategy, your good hands are going to be mixing between check call, bet, and check raise. Your draws between check call, bet, and check raise as well. And then your air hands are mostly going to be check folding. You will have a median here as well, meaning you'll have a range that's just going to be check calling due to mediocrity, maybe something like ace king with ace of diamonds. On the jack of clubs turn, again, pocket sixes is going to be mixing options. We're now building a toolkit of overbet, block, and check, because at this point when big blind checks back the flop, they're going to condense their range as we've seen, and they're going to move towards lower equity hands or lower to middle equity hands. They're still going to have some decent hands in their range, but things like 4, 5, 7, 6, 6s, 7s, and 3s, as well as some hands like pocket 8s, are going to be betting flop pretty much always in this spot. What that means is that villain now has a capped range, and we're going to benefit against that newly capped range by introducing the B150 as we saw in lecture 2. At the same time though, there's still 4 nodes left or 2 streets left in this game tree. Our opponent still has the in position bet opportunity after we check here, and so slow playing our middle set is definitely still going to be a reasonable option. Furthermore, when we think about the blockers of this hand, we're going to be blocking the middle of our opponent's range, again skewing their range towards weak and strong hands. When villain has a jack here, you do not need to bet, because jack X is very often going to reopen the action for you if you check. You're going to be able to check raise against the top of villain's range, as well as cause villain to bluff sometimes with hands that wouldn't have been able to call your bet, and so checking sixes is once again optional. On the Queen of Spades river, this is still optional. The only reason you see the solver doing a lot of betting now is that our range is quite happy on this card. Small blind has a lot more Queen X here than big blind, because small blind opens big offsuit Broadway cards that big blind would be 3-betting, and these are very combinatorically abundant, but also the queen is just likely to play this way in small blind's range. Hands like ace queen, king queen are quite likely to go check check on the flop and the turn. Therefore, on such a good card for range, we do a lot of betting, we have a lot of value bets now, and again we can use both sizes. However, pocket sixes specifically is still a pretty good candidate to slow play sometimes. The solver doesn't prefer betting to checking, it just knows that its range wants to bet a lot, and so this hand bets a lot. But checking is fine because again you have the kind of blockers on the river here, where even though urgency is now higher with only 1 street remaining and 2 nodes left, you're again going to be pushing your opponent's range towards a jack or a queen here by having these cards, and away from a hand like a 6, which would be inclined to call a bet but maybe check back if you checked. You have this sort of hand, in other words, that faces bets quite a lot after it checks, just due to its removal effects. Maybe the old generation of poker player got it right all along. I remember when internet poker, people like Tom Dwan came on the scene and started playing really aggressively, and the older school generation was just like, these kids are too aggressive. They're going to get what they deserve. I'm going to trap them. Then came a phase where no one trapped anymore, because it was just quote unquote wrong to slow play. And then came the Enlightenment, the phase of GTO where solvers came on the scene and people like me started studying the game endlessly for years, and eventually we realized that there were certain patterns to do with factors like urgency, factors like polarization, effective blockers, and things like this that we didn't used to know about, and these effects made slow playing okay again. Sometimes it goes full circle and you have things come in and out of fashion, and the same thing happens in poker, only now this is the end. We've reached the truth, we have game theory. So we're not going to go back to thinking that you can't slow play. So don't worry about it. You can definitely check sixes on the flop, on the turn, and on the river here. And if you're not comfortable with that, or you'd never do that, I want you to just do it and get used to it and make peace with the idea that, okay, occasionally when you check back on the flop here and villain has a 3 and it checks back, and then the same thing happens on the turn in the river and you make no money against a 3, and you feel silly, you're not silly because you probably maximize against other parts of villain's range. Against pocket 7s on the turn, you want to check, or on the flop, you can't have it on the turn. Against queen jack on the turn, you're happy checking, you can check raise. And if villains spike the queen on the river, guess what? They're betting anyway, you can check. So more checking is allowed out of position than you would think across all streets. Your urgency is always lower when you're out of position. Let's talk about that a bit more now. Let's consider urgency again. Here we have a run out of king 9 deuce 6 5. And what we see here is a type of hand at the bottom here. There's a vertical divider that's separating small blind versus big blind double barrel spots from a different kind of spot altogether, which is a bet, check, bet spot, small blind versus big blind on the river. What we see here is that on the turn with king jack, all of these options are possible. Smaller bets are possible because they're meant to get raised at some frequency. Bigger bets are possible because there is a nut advantage here that's quite prevalent for small blind. And checking is possible too, because of course we could check raise this combo, it's strong enough, and villain is going to be betting and reopening in position at quite a high frequency. With king 9, we can see that the solver is now just over betting or checking, and this is down to the blockers of the hand. The sort of hand that would raise a mediocre bet is going to be far more blocked by the 9 than with king jack. The reason for this is that villain is going to get to this turn with something like 9-6 and then be raising a mediocre bet, but not with a hand like jack-6, which would be folding on the flop. So these blockers are a little bit different, but as you can see, the main point here, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds of individual bet sizing because it's not a big swing theoretically in terms of EV, and it does come down to very specific card removal effects. So the main thing is urgency, whether you can check or not, and with king 9, you can still check, it's early on in the hand and you can still go for a check raise. While you do block a lot of villains value betting range with king 9, like 9-6 and king x, the good thing is that you also unblock bluffs. So king 9 suited has no blockers at all to hands like jack 10, queen jack, gutters like this that will call flop and then start blasting turn at quite a high frequency. Pocket 6s is a sort of hand, meanwhile, that has the kind of blockers we're going to refer to as polarizing. 6s will face a bet more often than most other hands, as we've said, by removing the middle of villain's range, pushing villain towards value bets and bluffs. Therefore, checking this hand is fine, but also B150ing here, unblocking the 9 and the king, which are the main component parts of a calling range, is also going to be okay. King jack offsuit in the bet check bet node, so now we're switching to a situation, just to compare, where small blind has c-bet the flop for 1/3 pot, being called, check the turn and big blind is checked behind, and then small blind arrives on the river with a betting opportunity. With king jack here, small blind has what we would refer to as a dangler. This card, the jack, the main effect it has is actually blocking bluffs. So what we're going to see with a hand like king jack is that there's actually more urgency to bet with these blockers. There's only one decision point left in the hand if small blind checks, so urgency is already inherently just higher than normal. But also, king jack is a hand that just has this jack blocker. What the jack is going to do is remove combos from villain's betting range and also make it more likely that villain has medium equity. The jack will be blocking mainly air hands, whereas combos like 10-9, king 4, pocket 8s, all of this stuff is going to be unblocked. Therefore, a hand like king jack, when you have this loose card that doesn't actually block anything on the board, but does block something that people choose to play pre-flop because it's a high card, I wouldn't call a 3 or a 4 a dangler here, because these cards don't exist. They've been folded pre-flop, or if not, folded on the flop. But the jack is a dangler because it does interfere with the air hands that villain could have, and therefore we want to fast play this hand. Note that one pair good kicker, top pair good kicker, is a very strong hand on a node where minimal investment has taken place. We're going to be betting the flop with the vast majority of our range in this spot, and then after turn check check, villain is capped and very wide. Therefore king jack easily qualifies for a B150. On this node, after villain has checked back on the turn, what we'll see is that villain is doing way less raising against medium-sized bets. Therefore, if we were to bet 75% of the pot here, we just wouldn't be getting raised often enough to make that better than overbetting. Therefore, we're going to favour the biggest sizing in our toolkit and try and reach that investment ceiling and not rely on our opponent to do that for us after they've condensed their range by checking back. King 9 of clubs is a strange hand. We refer to this as an anomaly hand because it plays differently to other hands that look to be of a similar class. Other hands with this much equity, for example a set of sixes, are going to be checking or overbetting, but King 9 is just going to be betting big. The reason for this, and we shouldn't get too carried away because other lines will be okay as well, but the reason this hand does this is mainly based on its removal effects. If you're going to bet small, you need to count on getting raised quite a lot of the time. And the hands that will raise you here will contain a king or a 9 pretty frequently. They're going to be value raises. So when you block those hands, you're getting raised at a much lower frequency when you B33, and so you're missing out on some EV. If you check here, the same sort of thing applies. The villain is actually going to have a hand like pocket 7s, pocket 8s, 6-6, etc. more often, and will be checking back a lot. You do unblock some bluffs with this hand, but you just block too many value bets. When you have a hand like 6s, villain's not only bluffing all of the queen 10, jack 10, queen jack, but they're also going to be betting for value with a good 9 or a king. But when you have both a 9 and a king, this isn't happening so often, so you may just want to bet immediately, unblocking hands like bad pairs and ace high that call but don't bet. It all makes sense when you break it down carefully. Pocket 6s again will see a very similar pattern, only this time our range is a bit more capped, we're doing a bit more checking. Overall, and in this situation, our blockers are very strongly polarizing our opponent's range. Villain just has a lot more natural value bets here like King X and 9X as well as bluffs, so we slow play. How do you identify this pattern? There are two ways of doing this. One is that you could just think about basic look of the board and the position of your pair within it. Make a rule, something to the effect of with third set often slow play the river if you've not bet the turn. That's decent, it will lead you to making a lot of correct plays in GTO. The problem is that if you don't know why that's the case and you don't make it explicit why that's the case in your rule, then you may miss opportunities to deviate from this to exploit people in future. And not only that, but you may just forget the rule because you don't have enough meaning to make it memorable. So instead, what I would say is think about the polarization of your blockers. River blocker theorem is something that only applies out of position and is a really good way to ingrain this concept. This isn't easy, but I hope I've introduced it subtly enough now for a long enough period of time that you guys are already getting some idea in your subconscious about how this works. But consider the following. We want to favour betting, this is for out of position, right, when holding value hands which unblock villains calling and checking behind ranges. In other words, if I have the type of removal effect that causes you to call me more often if I bet, then I want to bet. Similarly, if I would unblock your checking behind range, then I don't really want to slow play because you're going to check behind more often if I don't block any of your combos for doing that. Medium stuff calls bets, but it doesn't necessarily bet itself. Therefore, when you unblock medium stuff, you push your opponent's range towards a sort of concentration that allows them to invest mainly passively, and therefore you want to be aggressive. When you unblock medium stuff, you're going to block the betting range because you're actually going to be removing air combos or maybe hands like top pair, second pair from villain's range. If you block villain's betting range, then you'll face a bet less often after checking, and therefore checking for slow playing reasons is not such a good idea with this type of blocker property hand. When you hold these cards that unblock the calling and checking behind ranges, unblocking the middle and block the extremities, you're going to condense your opponent's range. This will decrease your opponent's bet frequency, but increase their calling frequency when you bet. A perfect example of that was the King Jack. You had top pair on the King 9 XXX board with a really good kicker, a hand with ample strength to value bet the river, and you did choose to value bet that hand because you unblocked the mediocre stuff like the bad 9 or the pocket pair or the third pair that would only invest by calling, therefore you wanted to bet, but you blocked villain's betting range. You blocked weaker top pair that could value bet, ensuring that you didn't face a bet as often, and you also blocked air by having the Jack Dangler, and that meant that you didn't face a bet as often. So river blocker theorem is actually quite clear once you get your head around the building blocks, but it can be a little bit of a struggle just to get your head around it, so do take your time at this part of the class. Do look for this in your own hands as well. Secondly, you'll want to favour checking when holding value hands which block villains calling or checking behind range, because if you block a calling range you don't get paid off as often, so betting isn't as good now, and if you block a checking behind range, then villain bets more often when you check, so checking is good now. Hands that block medium stuff will unblock the betting range if you check, the good and bad stuff. This is like the pocket sixes, and holding such cards will polarize the opponent's range, increasing their bet frequency when checked to, but decreasing their ability to pay you off with hands that couldn't have bet but can call. What does River Blocker Theorem say about the following hands on this texture? The node in question here is a bet check bet opportunity, small blind versus big blind. Have a look at these hands, pause the video, and then we'll move to the next slide to see the verdict. Assuming that you've done that, what did you think about the blockers of each of these three holdings? Pocket sevens, pocket kings, and queen jack suited. Here's the solution. Pocket kings is always betting and choosing to B150. This sim actually has 4 different inputs. 33, 75, 150 and 400 in the deep purple shade that's hardly being used. Most of the overbets you see here, like the kings, are B150. Why is kings going for this big bet? The idea is that when villain checks behind on the turn, they're more weighted towards queen x than king x. Most of the hands that actually pay off an overbet here are bluff catchers such as a queen or a 7. When you unblock all of those, it makes a lot of sense to bet, and of course your opponent will not be betting that often when you block their value betting range. Therefore, your blockers are very condensing, and with condensing blockers you should play aggressively. Note that this is counterintuitive. At first sight with king here, you might be tempted to check thinking I block the hand that calls me. That doesn't matter because the king bets anyway. What you really want to focus on here are the hands that you unblock that invest by calling but not by betting. And those are going to be things like a 7, a pocket pair, something like that that can bluff catch river. Queen jack of hearts is also pure betting when you have that suit. It's not as big a deal as kings. You could slow play this hand. You are, after all, blocking the queen, but the thing is, the queen's probably going to do a lot of betting here when checked to. Overall, the blocker properties of this hand are mainly in the direction of blocking bluffs. Because the queen invests either way, both by calling and by betting, it's not such a big deal that you block it. But what matters is that you block a jack. And a jack is a hand that would bluff freely and would constitute one of the more combinatorically abundant bluffs in your opponent's range. Therefore, just fast play when you're blocking bluffs. In other words, when you have a dangler, that's a relevantly big card that's going to appear in your opponent's range and is moreover going to constitute an air hand more often than not, like jack 10, jack 9, etc. Fast play, because they won't be bluffing as often after you check. Pocket sevens, you can go for a gargantuan overbet of 400% pot, but assuming that that isn't in your toolkit here, check is the way forward. Sevens has incredibly polarizing blockers, the opposite of the queen jack and the kings, because now you're actually making your opponent likely to hold danglers, cards that missed, but also to hold value bettable hands like a bad king or a queen. When villain has queen x plus, they'll value bet. When they have something like jack high, they will bluff. When they have sevens, they'll check back. By removing the 7, you're removing the check back range, you're forcing your opponent's range to bet more frequently theoretically, and thus you want to let them bet first and then raise. Whenever you can check raise, it's usually okay not to value bet, especially when you're going to be facing a bet more often. Why do you think the big blind checks to the button on ace ace 3? Because they'll very often be facing a bet. That's why you check sevens here. There are 3 main types of slow playing in poker that you want to get used to. First off, you have a theoretical slow play. We can say that hero slow plays, theoretically, when he checks a hand that's strong enough to satisfy the definition of can value bet from lecture 1, which is basically the idea that there are elements of value present and it's not better to check. Thereby, you'll suffer no EV loss at all at equilibrium for checking. The pocket sevens hand that we just looked at is a great example of a completely fine theoretical slow play, one that's approved by the solver and there's no reason not to do it. Secondly, we have exploitative slow playing. Hero slow plays exploitatively whenever he checks a hand that is, given the urgency of the spot, strong enough to satisfy the definition of should value bet. In other words, we have a hand like the pocket kings that's actually got the right blockers for value betting, or maybe we're just in position on the flop and should value bet, or maybe we just have a certain SPR that's really big and we have to get pot building. But either way, theory tells us that it's not okay to slow play. Urgency is too high, but we do it anyway, and we do it because we think it's the best play in exploitative reality. In other words, we think our actual opponent, or the population, or the rough player type is playing in such a way that even though theory says that we should bet here, we think checking will be better. We've deviated, we've gone off the beaten track because we think it's the best route to take. Thirdly, we have erroneous slow plays. Erroneous slow plays occur when we check a hand that's actually strong enough to satisfy the definition of should value bet given urgency, and thereby is accepting an EV loss at equilibrium by checking, and in the real world too, value betting is better. So there is no exploitative reason to deviate here, but we're doing it anyway. It's never okay to make an erroneous slow play. You'll hear people make erroneous slow plays all the time and try to justify it, but if theory is telling you it's better to bet than check, then you should unless you have an exploitative read. I want us to get better at recognizing each of these types of slow play. Which ones are GTO approved, which ones are okay as deviations, and which ones are not okay in any way, shape or form. Let's do an exercise now that will help us train this recognition. There are 3 questions here that I want you to look at. Firstly, hero defends ace-9 with a button open in the big blind at 10 NL. I'm going to give you some details here. They may be useful, they may be red herrings, they may not matter, but as this concerns some exploiting as well, this exercise, I want you to consider them. The flop comes king 6-4 monotone, and we decide to check, and the button checks back. On the turn, we as the big blind check again with the nut flush draw. Again, it checks behind, and on the river, we decide to check our flush. Which type of slow play is this? Do you think that this is theoretically okay? Do you think it's exploitatively warranted? Or do you think it's just not okay at all? Question 2, I want you to assign a label to this as well. And you should only use each label once. There are 3 questions, there are 3 labels. Hero opens queen 10 in the small blind, and a passive recreational player calls in the big blind. The flop comes queen 5-3, and it goes check check. Turn is ace of hearts, it checks again, and the river is the 6 of spades, and we have this double delayed c-bet opportunity with queen 10. We decide to check the river. Which type of slow play is this? Question 3, jack 9 of clubs, again, blind versus blind spot. This time we're against a very weak poker player who's very aggressive, aggro whale, as we like to say. Check check on the flop, check check on the turn, and we check on the 6 of spades river against this player. Which type of slow play is this? I'll give you a second just to pause and make sure you're happy with your answers. Again, you should only have assigned 1 label to each of these questions, and you can only use each label once. Let me go over my answers now. Question 1 is completely fine. There's no reason why you can't slow play a flush. Flushes are in general just hands that are pretty good to slow play in many situations because they block continuing ranges and unblock bluffs. If you think about what villain will be bluffing here, it'll be usually something like queen high. It won't contain the ace of spades, that's for sure. The 9, okay, that maybe blocks a few bluffs, but overall, check raising is fine here. If you can check raise, you usually don't have to value bet, especially when you don't strongly block bluffs, so there's no problem with this. I think you could bet this hand, but you would want to do a lot of checking here. The thing is that you unblock both value bets and bluffs here. Villain's main value bets are just random lower spades, which you aren't blocking. So slow playing this hand is going to be absolutely fine because villain is going to be value betting many worse hands here. They have plenty of worse flushes like king jack with the jack of spades. That possibly bets turn, maybe queen jack with the jack of spades, jack 10, pocket jacks, pocket queens, pocket 8s. All of these hands are betting. You can check raise against all of these hands and you're unblocking bluffs because while villain will be bluffing with ace high here, they won't be bluffing with this ace of spades. That's clearly going to be one of their value bets. But that's fine, that's a hand that invests either way, so it's not really important what you have with respect to that. Question 2, we have the queen of clubs, 10 of hearts. This one, the trademark thing is that we have a dangler. We do have a hand that's good enough to value bet here, and we have this 10 that's blocking bluffs. So in theory, this is not a slow play. This is the mandatory value bet in game theory. The hand is too good not to value bet when you're blocking your opponent's bluffs, so we go for it. And note that we have very condensing blockers here because we aren't blocking the mediocre pairs in our opponent's range, like the 6, the 5, pocket 7s, or pocket 8s. Going for a check here is definitely weird, but maybe it's okay if we can exploitatively justify it. Can we justify slow playing second pair against a passive player? One that's likely to invest mainly by calling and not by betting? Absolutely not. This is the opposite read to the one that we would need to have, make this deviation, and so we must bet our hand. This is an erroneous slow play. By process of elimination, the third one is exploitative, but let's see why. With the jack 9 here against an aggro player, it's very likely that if the aggressive player has not bet already, then they're going to find it hard to resist a third time with air. Therefore, we don't have to worry about villain being too passive on the river if they're holding nothing. On the other hand, they may well bet merged hands that while could call and shouldn't bet, this player will bet with them. So for example, against a solid player, You would never expect them to bet something like ace-5 here on the river. But against the aggressive, weak player who really doesn't know what's going on, that'll happen a lot. You check 3 times, I bet. That could be the end of the thought process right there. There doesn't need to be any more meat on those bones, necessarily. When someone has a fairly primitive and aggressively minded thought process, you're going to want to let them bluff all of the air that they have, because that's the only way to make money from those hands. You may also not incur any loss against the middle of their range if they're just randomly merging hands they should be checking back. This player will probably value bet a 7 or a 6 here, as they should in theory, or will bet for whatever reason goes through their head. They'll bluff, and they'll also bet some hands they shouldn't, like ace 10. Therefore, I think it's very clear that we should be deviating to checking on this node, even though the hand in equilibrium would be a bet because of the 9 dangler, pushing villain's range away from air and towards the middle. This is a condensing blocker, but it's one that we should deviate with and choose to bet in this spot. I want to just stress one thing before we move on, and that is that exploitative considerations are very often going to trump these blocker effects. So the effect of hand 3 being against this aggressive opponent is much more important than whether we have a 9 dangler or not. The reason for this is that there's only one opponent and their tendencies can dictate our entire EV, whereas a 9 as a removal effect can only ever interfere with one brick in the wall, so to speak, only with a very small part of villain's range. So don't forget that, guys. Don't misprioritize. Game theory is your foundation, but it doesn't trump big exploitative reads that are very powerful. But people make mistakes when slow playing all the time, and it wouldn't be a Carrot Poker School lecture without a bunch of pitfalls for you guys to avoid. Here's the first one I want to talk about: the gratification trap. Sometimes students make erroneous slow plays because they prioritize making a bet at all costs when they have a very strong hand. They're actually afraid of villain folding because it triggers this "I didn't get what I'm due" reaction. And as we saw last time, the goal when playing a strong hand is to maximize EV. And this might mean sacrificing some call frequency for some call magnitude. In other words, we need to be careful that we don't seek gratification, that we don't seek this rewarding feeling of being paid off, and we don't fear not getting it. You don't deserve to get called because you have a good hand. And the goal of value betting is in fact not to get called. That's right, it's to make as much money as possible in the long run. That might mean getting called less often. So whatever you do, don't bet a size you think they'll call. Bet a size that's right for your equity, depending on how often you're getting raised to counterbalance that. And overall, you'll run into people that fold too much, you'll run into people who call too much, but it'll be fine. Don't stress it. The main way in which I see this happen is not people checking spots where they should be betting. If anything, I'd say it's more common for my students to miss slow plays than to slow play in spots where they shouldn't. But what they do is bet too small because they just want to get called at all costs. You see people betting 50% of the pot with a hand that should be overbetting on the river. Things like this. We'll see this when we talk about greed theorem next time. The blinkered vision trap. Students also fall into the trap of only caring about one part of the game tree or one part of their opponent's range. They may say something like, "I was hoping he would bluff," or "I was hoping I would induce with my small bet." Well, if your hand actually blocks polarized hands, then this can constitute a loss of EV. You're choosing a random part of the game tree and you've pretended it's the whole game tree. The reason the blinkered vision trap happens is that poker is an extremely complicated game, and it can be really difficult to get your head around its entirety. But one thing I would say is that if you ever catch yourself zooming in on one part of the game tree to simplify the game for yourself, try and catch yourself in the act and zoom back out. Try and look at all of your opponent's range. It may not be correct to try to induce against air. If you block air and unblock the middle of your opponent's range, then you should just be value betting bigger. Deception trap is something that's probably a bit more prominent in absolute beginners or beginner to intermediate players. Not so much intermediate to advanced ones, but this is the idea that you need to deceive your opponent as to the strength of your hand. Wanting to be really deceitful is not actually the thing that you should be seeking to do. You do want to be balanced where things are 0 EV, and you want to be mixing where one play and another play have the same EV, like overall, although it's not that important in a vacuum or even in one night of playing a session online, and usually you don't suffer much repercussion. So balance has some place in poker, but not a huge amount. But deception really has none. If you're playing a solid strategy, your range will already be disguised. You don't need to worry that if you overbet that you don't have a tier 2 hand, as long as you can have bluffs. When you overbet, you should be saying to villain, "I either have a tier 1 really strong value hand or I'm bluffing," and that's fine. You don't need to be also making him think that you could have second pair. That's just ludicrous, and it's deception just for deception's sake. But deception can cause people to slow play because they instantly river a set and check. And that's probably a good thing to do actually, because rivering a set is one of the hands you want to slow play, but it's not the point. There's many spots exploitatively and theoretically as well in which you need to fast play, so don't like quickly try to do the opposite thing of what your hand strength is. This is the trap. Many of you have outgrown this, but we all probably suffered from this at one point. Let's move on to the really key concepts of frailness and robustness now. Hand's robustness is its ability to beat bluffs without improving, so that means that you may not need to bluff later, which is an important thing because bluffing later costs you money when it doesn't work. It's an additional tax on calling, having to make that bluff just to win. The robust hands don't need to do that. They can invest money without fold equity, they can beat bluffs without improving. Hand's frailness, which is the opposite of robustness therefore, is the extent to which it may lose to bluffs when it doesn't improve, or struggle to invest without fold equity. These are just opposites. Today's focus is on frailness and robustness when it comes to making bets out of position. So here's a really confusing but actually quite simple when you break it down diagram for us to feast our eyes on. What we see here is robustness / frailty along the x-axis. At the left hand side we're looking at the most frail hands possible. These hands will be bluffing where they have the opportunity a lot of the time out of position, especially if they have high EV, because they need to actually realize fold equity and equity, and the only way they can do that is by betting, because if they check and happen to face a bet, they won't always, but when they do, continuing will be very difficult and they may have to check fold. Hands that we bluff are typically frail, or at least mostly frail, because they struggle to win without improving and struggle to invest money without fold equity. Then we hit tier 4. This is the middle part of your range, which is just going to be slow playing most of the time and checking or calling. Not slow playing, I shouldn't say that. It should be, we'll be playing passively. Slow playing is when you play a strong hand passively. This is not a strong hand. So the middle of your range is going to be quite robust. The robustness is definitely increasing, and it's reached a certain point where you no longer want or need to bluff. And then when you hit your value region, your hands are very robust, but you're not talking about bluffing anyway by that point. It's just a question of whether you can value bet or not. This is obviously not smooth enough to reflect the strength of a real range. There isn't just this exactly the same hand strength for tier 4 for a long time like this. You have hands increasing in robustness gradually, but you do reach a point where you just no longer need to bluff, and that's what we call a robustness threshold, where you can just call, and we'll see this more in lectures 8 and 9. Not much else to say, I just wanted to introduce these concepts for now, and then we'll get into them in a bit more detail. The robustness and hand tier now, how does this work? Let's go back to ace 9, 4, 8, with 3 flush, and we'll have a look at how some hands are playing in this situation. So again, in the delayed c-bet node, we have the chance to bet 33% pot or check on this turn. What I'm going to look at here is a few different hands and how they're going to be behaving. Let's map out the hands first of all. Let's begin with Jack 10. We get to this turn after flop goes check check, and we have the chance to delayed c-bet the turn for 33% pot. What do you think this hand is going to be doing? This is a tier 5 bluff if we use the terminology of lecture 3, meaning that it has a gain of EV between bluffing and not bluffing. It's one of the more suitable hands to bluff, and that's because it doesn't do very well by checking, so check EV is quite low, but the redraw is reasonable. So this hand always bets. This hand is never a check in our toolkit because it would really rather not check raise without a spade, and is far too good to consider checking and check folding. Therefore, you'd have to check raise it or check call it depending on villain sizing if you checked, but that may not be as good as just betting immediately, or isn't as good as betting immediately. So due to this hand's frailty, it actually has to bet. Frailty is a reason for betting when your hand has something going on. If you have nothing here, like the king deuce of hearts, you may just give up, you may just check because you're not in a great world and you have nothing going on with your hand, but this hand can bet. These next two hands are what we would call robust or semi-robust hands. They can win by checking, and so they do. King Queen is kind of a mixed bag of reasons for betting. Maybe villain can fold similar hands that don't have a spade that you're mostly chopping with, like King Queen of Diamonds. And also villain can call with a few worse hands with spade draws or straight draws or both. And you can obviously get a lot of useful denial and also have a value element from hitting the nut flush on the river. So there's a mixed bag. It's very much a hybrid type bet. There's a lot of different reasons for betting such a hand, and we'll talk a lot about hybrids next time in lecture 6. Pocket 3 is again a hybrid, betting a lot for various different reasons, but going to be classed as a robust hand. The reason that both of these hands usually check is that they can win without having to venture future bets as bluffs and without having to improve. Although if they do improve, it's a bonus. Now on to some much worse hands that have weaker draws. Queen 3 of clubs is a tier 7 hand, meaning it's way down there in terms of bluff selection due to how hopeless it is, how much it unblocks villains' continuing range if we bet, and blocks their folding range. Therefore, the Queen 3 of clubs is going to be doing a bit more checking than Jack 10, but it's actually still okay to bet because this is an okay world for a range. This is not a dreadful world, and so we don't have to be super selective like we would need to be in a turn probe opportunity. King 10 have said 4/7. To understand what this means, the hand is tier 4 in the sense that it has a lot of showdown value and is able to win by checking down, but if it does bluff, it's tier 7. We are allowed to bluff some tier 7 hands after villain checks back and the flop is ace high blind versus blind. We do protect our checking range on the flop, and so we do preserve our equity advantage. Moreover, villain will bet quite a few flush draws on the flop, though of course they should check some of them. 5s is too good to be bluffing, but if it did bluff it would be tier 7. If it turned itself into a bluff, it's not a particularly great candidate to use, and it's just checking because it's too robust to consider doing that anyway. In other words, robustness affects how close to tier 4 you are when you don't have a great hand. If you have a lot of robustness, you're probably too high up to bluff. The less robustness, i.e. the more frail your hand, the further from tier 4 you are and the more incentivized you are to bluff. But you do need to think about the tier of your bluff, meaning tier 5 through 7 as well. In favourable-ish worlds like this one, there's no problem betting an array of different hands. Firstly, because the world is decent, and secondly, because you're betting small. But what you wouldn't want to do is bet bigger here with a lot of these hands, and what you wouldn't want to do is be betting hands like this in less favourable worlds. Let's talk about probing now on the river. Big blind against hijack, and check call on the flop from big blind against B33. The turn goes check check, and we're on to the Jack of Hearts river. This is not a fantastic card for big blind, and while big blind will usually be doing really well here, the Jack is a card on which they'll be doing a bit less well. This is the overall strategy though, and here are some focused questions for us to get stuck into. Firstly, what is the favourability for the big blind? What are some of the theoretically correct slow plays available here? What tier is ace-queen suited? And finally, which suit or suits of king 10 suited do you think are checking here? You can see that that hand is checking sometimes. I'll assume that you've answered these and you've had time to pause the video and work that out, and let's go over my answers. The favourability is good for big blind. I don't think it's the best run out in the world, and we could have had a better river than the Jack of Hearts for sure. Given that hands like king queen offsuit are checking down sometimes, it's clearly not amazing, or we'd be bluffing really high up into our showdown value as we've seen. But this is still a really good world, and we do need to bluff when we're really low down here in our range. What are some theoretical slow plays? Typically flushes are going to be totally fine to slow play with because they're always going to unblock bluffs really heavily. Hijack is going to be barreling turn a lot with one diamond, and so most of hijack's bluffs on this node, where it goes bet, check, bet, are more going to be the other suits, something like king 5 of spades rather than something with a diamond in it. Not exclusively, but this pattern is strong enough to make us want to slow play flushes. This is yet another reason why flushes are just not great at fast playing. What tier is ace-queen suited? This is definitely a very good hand. Ace-queen on this sort of node is going to be tier 2, meaning that maybe it can't overbet, but it can definitely big bet or block. If we look at other ace-x that are lower, those tend to go down to just tier 3, but ace-queen is comfortably a tier 2 hand, and it's mixing some slow play in the form of check and some slow play in the form of betting small. This is obviously relying on hijack raising often enough, and where that isn't happening, this hand should just be fast playing. Which suit or suits of king 10 suited are checking? Actually, only diamonds. King 10 of clubs is too far down here and is bluffing in a favourable world. Only king 10 that is checking here is the king 10 of diamonds at some frequency, because again, flushes are generally quite sensible slow plays. Let's look at an absolutely nightmarish situation. Small blind is going to hate the flop of 7-6 deuce, particularly when it's rainbow. The worse the rank of card for the raiser, the more they would like that to be monotone, because then they could actually hit flushes in order to catch up against the opponent's high density of pairs, straight draws, straights, etc. No straights possible here, but you get the point. So if the flop is 7-6-5 monotone, that's not that bad for small blind, because small blind has all the big cards, and thus all the big flushes and flush draws on that spot. On 7-6 deuce rainbow, those big cards are all terrible, and it's big blind that enjoys that rank in terms of hitting pairs and two pair more often. Therefore, big blind is going to be playing quite a lot of B75s. We see this in grade 1, that this strategy for this flop could easily be a big bet at quite a high frequency, semi-polarized strategy, and small blind check calls. The turn goes check check and small blind lands on the river on the 5 of hearts and is now in a pretty favourable world because the opponent polarised and then checked. Meanwhile, we check called a big bet, getting rid of all the bad stuff from our range and pushing us towards something that likes this run out or was just strong like an overpair in the first place. Therefore, big blind is super capped here and we can go for some very big bets indeed. Here we see the solver use B400, really exploiting the Clark's theorem idea that our range is much more polarised than our opponent's. Well, we have a lot of straights here, overpairs, sets. Our opponent would have bet most of those on a turn because urgency in position is higher when you face a check. Here are some focused questions. What's the favourability for out of position? That's equity against equity. Why is B400 so common? For which reason is King 4 suited betting and why is it allowed to do this? And finally, why are 7s and 6s playing differently from each other in this spot? Again, pause, answer the questions to the best of your ability and I'll tell you what I think. Assuming you've done that. Favourability is fantastic. We are absolutely going to bluff with any air that we land with on this river. Because of that, the fold equity will be way above the pot odds norm here. Big blind is not incentivized to slow play on this turn like we would be if we were the aggressor out of position because they're in position. B400 is so common due to the sheer cappedness of big blind's range and the relatively uncappedness of our range by comparison, Clark's theorem. For which reason is King 4 suited betting this is clearly a bluff, and a mandatory one. It's allowed to do so because the fold equity promised such a favourable landscape is sky high, making the bluff inherently profitable. Even if this hand could show down, sometimes in chop or something like that, or maybe even win, it's probably still good to bluff it. Well, it definitely is. Why are 7s and 6s playing differently? They have subtly different blocker effects. While pocket 6s is going to block a 6 and unblock a 7, and while that's going to force our opponent into betting a bit more often with a second pair that's value bettable and checking back less often due to having less third pair that's not value bettable, pocket 7s will be the opposite. Pocket 7s blocks bets because villain could have bet second pair but unblocks the hands that check back and only invest by calling. Therefore, you want to fast play with the 7s and slow play with the 6. It's okay to bet small with the 7s though, because a hand that would raise you here is something like a 10 and you unblock that. Blockers are pretty tricky, but once you get your head around them, they get easier. For homework this week, I would like you to locate a hand in your database or just recall a live hand that you've played in the following 3 notes. This can be an older hand and you can critique your former self on how they played, or you can look at a hand that you played more recently or even after watching this class. Small blind versus big blind, a double delayed c-bet is the first node when you have a value candidate hand that's tier 1 to 3. What does your hand want to do in this spot where it's gone check, 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 check and you've got the chance to bet river? What does river blocker theorem say about your hand? And if you check, what kind of slow play would it be? Would it be theoretical? Would it be exploitative? Or would it just be erroneous and therefore should you check? Then try and find another one and answer the same questions again, but this time, big blind versus button river probe opportunity is what you're looking for. You've called flop and turn is checked through, and you're big blind. And thirdly, big blind against in position turn probe opportunity. Try to locate all of these spots. And finally, the third spot is turn probe opportunity. Flop goes check, check. And I want you to ask yourself this time, what does your hand do in theory? What sizing should it use, and how robust or frail is your hand? Remember, the more frail the hand, the more incentivized it's going to be to bluff immediately rather than trying to check raise or check call. Hope you guys have enjoyed lecture 5 on the out of position game. Definitely a tricky topic, but a very eye-opening one for most people. This is one of the lectures that transforms how people play the most. Hope it does the same for you and really helps you review the tables. I'll see you back here for lecture 6 when we'll flip the table round and look at playing in position. See you then.